The first sound is not the wind, though the cornfields bend under a low sky like a sea of iron blades. It is not the house timbers either, though they groan as if something heavy presses against them from the inside. It is a wet, deliberate dragging that comes from the barn, soft, rhythmic, like a tongue pulled across wooden teeth. In the half-light before dawn, the farm wears a blue bruise. The horizon holds back the sun the way a tight fist holds back blood, and in that held breath, the air tastes of rain that has not learned how to fall. Mist hangs over the pasture, low and thin, and through it the cattle drift like pale monuments sliding forward an inch at a time. Their breath steams, their ears twitch, their tails rest unnaturally still. Every shadow is longer than it should be, and every fence post has more corners than the carpenter ever gave it. Somewhere out there a rooster begins a strangled crow, rasps 3 notes and decides against finishing. Silence pours in after it, colder than before. On the porch, the swing is swaying with no wind to marry. The chain creaks and mutters, a conversation carried on in secret as the chain shifts one link then the next. As though a weight had just lifted and left behind a memory of its motion, a moth bumps the glass of the porch lamp, tapping at the same patch again and again until a faint chalky smear blooms where it has been. The bulb is dead, yet the moth will not learn. There is light here anyway, an ill-thickening light that does not ask permission to be seen. The barn door is not truly open, not truly shut. It yawns with a slack-lipped apology, admitting a slit of black that is too dense to be called ordinary shadow and too calm to be called a mouth. Beyond that black, the dragging continues, wet and certain, as if something inside has a purpose and knows exactly where to put it. On the sill of the door, an old horseshoe has been hung for luck since before anyone living could remember, and this morning it has turned itself upside down, slowly emptying out whatever it used to hold. A boy's ball, dimpled like an orange skin, rests at the base of the step. Dew bead glitters on its surface. The dew is pink, not the joyous pink of a summer watermelon, but a thin medicinal pink that makes the tongue recoil. When a breeze finally does tremble through the yard, it does not touch the corn or the oaks. It only moves the grass directly between the porch and the barn, laying a narrow path flat, a comb stroke pressed hard enough to leave the parting. The house's windows are blind. Curtains have been drawn so tightly for so many seasons that the fabric has grown brittle, and where the sun once ate their color, a faint anatomy of the threads shows through. Veins of the house. In the kitchen, if you could step through the quiet and see, you would find a coffee cup resting on the stove cold as a stone. A ring of brown kisses its lip. A hand once set it there and promised to come right back. The hand did not keep its promise, and the coffee kept waiting until night taught it how to be mud. The dragging stops. It stops as if it has discovered that someone is listening and would prefer to let the listener worry about that discovery in peace. In the pause, a fly lands on the threshold and rubs its legs together with an almost clerical diligence. Its tiny face looks into the dark gap as if taking stock. It lifts and goes the way flies do, to the dew-smeared ball, to the pink shine that cannot be dew, and then to the porch, where it finds a second fly already listing as if a storm moves through its fragile body. The second fly is not moving its legs. The second fly is missing them entirely. They lie nearby like stray punctuation. A soft scrape answers the silence, not from the barn now, but from the loft above it. Pigeons once lived there, a rattling flock that turned the dusk into a storm of papery thunder. They have been absent for weeks. Today one remains. He rides the ledge with puffed chest and gouty feet, his pearl head cocked, king of an empty kingdom. He gives the smallest coo. It is answered from below by something that does not coo. The pigeon's chest collapses. His crown of feathers flattens into fear. He looks to the hay door, where the rope hangs. The rope sways. It sways as if the loft itself were breathing and had decided to teach the rope how. Down in the pasture, a cow steps forward. She lifts her head and shows her throat to the dull morning, as if offering it up to a priest. On her white hide, something interrupts the dew in a perfect line from shoulder to flank. It is not mud or burrs. It is not a cut. It is something the eye wants to name and cannot, something that looks like a language burned into skin. The characters curving in ways letters never learned to curve. Another cow stands behind her, and another, and another, and as the mist thins, more of those lines emerge, spiraling around bellies tucked under ribs, looped around eyes like sleeping serpents. The herd does not move as one. It moves as if connected by a single thought that is having trouble deciding what to think of itself. The earth at the fence line has been disturbed. Last night there was grass there thick as a mat. Now a shallow trench runs parallel to the fence for 30 yards, a child's finger drawn through cake icing. At intervals, small piles of dirt have been thumbed up and patted carefully like offerings. In the middle of the trench there is a print, not hooved, not booted. 5 ovals, sharply defined, arranged in a half circle, and beneath them a long, dragging crescent where something heavy and patient slid, lifted, slid again. The print points toward the barn, which insists on its yawn. From the far field, there comes the sound of a single mismatched bell. There has not been a bell on this farm for generations, not since the last draft horse went to bone in memory. Yet the bell rings, as if struck by a polite fingertip from inside the earth. Between the rings you can hear the hush of the corn speaking to itself, leaf on leaf, a whisper of old secrets and new rumors. The bell falls quiet. The whispering stops answering. Even the insects shiver themselves to stillness. And in that vacuum, a wordless thought forms in the space where the house, the barn, and the field share a single center. It is not the first time. If you stand at the foot of the porch steps, you can smell the sweet rot of apples long fallen beneath the tree by the side fence. You can smell cooling dust. You can smell the barn powder, the dry, settled scent of hay and rope and animal breath gone stale. Under that, travelers from the highway would say they catch the perfume of rain coming, iron and lavender mixed. But the nose that belongs to this place knows better. That is not rain. It is the memory of the first time the ground was asked to drink more than water. The rope in the loft sways, then stops. The horseshoe holds its wrongness like a smile it cannot turn honest. The moth taps again at the dead bulb, chalking its devotion onto a halo that will never shine. From the black seam of the barn door, something gathers itself with a little wet patience, the way a slug gathers into a curl when touched. It is not defensive. It is curious. The sound it makes is like a wet book closing. Perhaps it is only the wood settling. Perhaps it is only the morning growing a spine. The boy's ball rolls 1 inch and stops. It is not the breeze. It is the path of flattened grass, which deepens, which commits, which reconciles itself with its own decision to exist. If you were to follow it with your eyes, you would see that it runs straight as a measured breath from the porch steps to the barn sill, and then continues within, a pale stripe in the darkness like a road drawn on a map of a country that has never welcomed tourists. It is as if something long and deliberate has traveled that exact route so many times that the ground has given up pretending not to notice. A sound comes up from the well, deep, pipe-throated, a throat too big to be a throat. The well hasn't drawn water right in years. It coughs into the air, and for a moment the mist thins where the cough touches it, showing clear space all the way to the pasture and the marked bodies of the cattle in the trench along the fence. The clear space is a corridor, and down it moves a smell like salt rinds and pennies and the thin, sweet stink of a butcher's apron left overnight in the rain. It finds you at the steps. It finds you if you stand on the porch. It finds you even if you are inside the kitchen staring at the cold coffee you promised you would come back for, and it tells you gently that something is awake. The dragging resumes, and now it is not alone. It is answered by a soft ticking that seems to come from everywhere at once, a counting out of seconds that does not belong to clocks. With each tick, a fly halts mid-air. A moth bashes itself one last time against a bulb that owes it nothing. A blade of grass folds as if kneeling. Tick in a cow's ear notches forward. Tick in the pigeon in the loft lowers his head all the way to the floor as if his neck has learned a new rule. Tick in the horseshoe hops a hair in its nail and clinks as if offering a very small toast. You might think the sun would be impatient with such nonsense. It is not. It drags its light out of bed the way a man drags after a funeral, slow and subdued, unwilling to uncover things that clearly prefer to stay in their nightclothes. The horizon loosens its fist and lets one thin wire of gold through, a wretched thing that barely qualifies as mourning. That ribbon lays itself across the barn door and stops there, as if painted and already dry. It cannot see inside. Light cannot go where it is not invited. At the edge of the yard near the cedar that never took to this soil, the ground is darker than the ground around it. It is not shadow, precisely. It is saturation. The dark patch is exactly the size of a man laid from crown to heel. The grass on it has been combed backward by a heavy palm. At the top of that shape something glints, a button, pearl with a hairline crack. It blinks in the sorry light and then turns dull again as if an eye had closed. From within the barn, the dragging hitches and changes direction. It does not go at random. It comes toward the door. The gap looks deeper for noticing it, as if depth were a shy child that grows bold when called by name. There is no breeze now. There is the softest of breath, but it is not yours. It is the breath a person gives when they are about to speak the first sentence of a story that will make the hearer wish they had never learned language at all. At the last instant, before it shows itself, the sound stops again, and the farm remembers how to hold still. A cow in the mist coughs a long, uncertain cough and bites at nothing in particular. The rope in the loft relocates its patience and decides not to move. The moth, the stubborn student, taps once, twice, 3 times, and finds that the glass is warmer than before. On the porch, the swing makes a single tiny forward nudge, like a man who has just told a lie and needs to lean into it to make it stand. Something inside the barn takes a breath that is more like a tide reversing. The morning light, thin as it is, flinches from the threshold, as if it has seen at last what dwells on the other side, and does not feel equal to the task of naming it. In the silence after that breath, another sound surfaces, quiet and cruel, a gentle, careful licking, the way a mother cleans a newborn. It goes on, patient and thorough, and when it stops, the quiet afterward is so complete that the farm feels hollow, a skull behind a face it has worn too long. Then from the dark seam a single wet mark slides into the light and kisses the sill, a long, spiraling line that curves with a grammar your eyes want to translate. It glows for a heartbeat like an ember passed by a careful hand. The spiral matches perfectly the first of the marks on the nearest cow. Who exactly has been teaching the animals a new alphabet here, and what does it spell out when it finally speaks? It had been 22 years since Samuel Vance had left the farm, and almost as many since he'd intended to come back. The land had belonged to his family for 3 generations, stretching out from the county road in a patchwork of fields, barns, and oak stands that he had once known as intimately as the lines of his own hand. But cities and wars and marriages had a way of turning those lines into something foreign. And when the lawyer's letter came, typed, polite, unbending, announcing that the last of his blood had gone into the ground, Samuel had almost ignored it. Almost. He arrived on a rainless afternoon, late summer, the air so hot it felt as if the whole county were holding its breath. The farmhouse rose up from the earth with that stubborn, self-possessed gravity old structures carried. Its roof sagged slightly at the center, shingles baked pale, and the porch boards curled like the pages of a forgotten book. The windows, tall, narrow, and curtained in yellowed lace, watched him with the patient stillness of something that had been awake for far too long. Samuel stepped from the truck, his boots finding the dirt drive with a muffled crunch. The smell hit him first. Not the sweet hay and manure of his childhood memories, but a heavier odor, metallic and sweet all at once, like rust buried under a blanket of damp leaves. The air clung to his skin as he made his way toward the porch, brushing past weeds that had grown tall enough to nod at his shoulders. Every step stirred a thin, invisible film of dust that settled on his tongue, dry and bitter. Inside, the house greeted him with its old bones, floors that creaked in familiar protest, walls that sighed when he closed a door. The kitchen still wore the same chipped enamel table, the same deep-bellied sink that had swallowed countless plates and spoons. A single coffee cup rested on the stove as though someone had stepped out mid-sip. Its surface bore the faint brown ring of evaporated liquid, and Samuel, without thinking, reached for it before pulling his hand back. It was cold as stone. In the living room, the curtains were drawn so tightly that they seemed part of the wall, sealing out the day. He flicked a light switch, but nothing answered. The bulb overhead hung lifeless. Dust motes floated in the narrow beam from the hallway, catching in his eyelashes. Somewhere above, the roof timbers murmured under a weight that might have been the wind, but the air outside was still. It was the land that drew him next. He stepped out the back door and let his eyes sweep across the pasture. The grass lay flat in irregular patches, as though something heavy had pressed it down from above. In the distance, cattle stood too still, their heads held at an unnatural angle. The marks he'd noticed that morning were clearer now, patterns curling into each other, thin as hair, yet dark enough to pierce the hide. They looked less like wounds and more like writing, each curve and loop deliberate, each one part of a language the earth itself might have spoken if it had a mouth. The barn squatted on the far edge of the yard, its red paint faded to a weary pink. One door leaned inward, revealing a slice of shadow so thick it seemed solid. The smell was stronger here, a sweetness that threatened to turn the stomach if you breathed too deeply. Samuel hesitated at the threshold, his palm grazing the wood, feeling the grooves left by decades of opening and closing. The wood felt damp, but not from rain. His skin prickled. A memory rose unbidden. His grandfather, leaning against the same doorway, warning him never to go inside after dark. "Animals see things we can't," the old man had said, his voice low and flat. "And sometimes those things see us back." At 12, Samuel had laughed, thinking it was a farmhand's superstition. Now, with the smell thick in his nostrils and the cattle silent as stone, he wasn't so sure. Evening settled without ceremony. Shadows stretched long and thin, the horizon bleeding into a deep violet. From somewhere beyond the far fence came the sound of a bell, soft, slow, impossibly distant. Samuel turned toward it, but the fields beyond were empty. No movement, no light. Just the ringing, fading into the air as if it had never been. He stood there for a long while, hands in his pockets, feeling the land's quiet press against him. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of something holding its breath, waiting. And though the night had not yet fallen, the darkness in the barn's open mouth seemed to swell, patient and certain, as if it had been expecting him all along. Samuel woke before dawn, not because of any alarm, but because the silence had weight. It lay on his chest, pressing him into the mattress until his eyes opened of their own accord. The room was dark except for a thin seam of gray light leaking around the edges of the curtains. It was not the soft light of morning, more like the faint illumination of deep water, where the sun exists but refuses to touch you. He sat up, listening. No rooster, no distant hum of the county road. Even the insects that had sung through the night were gone. Somewhere in the house a board creaked, sharp and deliberate, as if a single step had been taken by something that understood how sound carries. He reached for the lamp by the bed. The bulb gave a low, reluctant glow, before dying with a soft pop. The air was colder than the night before, and when Samuel's bare feet touched the floor, the wood felt slick, as though someone had walked there with wet soles. He crossed to the window and drew back the curtain. The pasture was a pale sheet under a heavy mist. The cattle stood in small clusters, heads bent low, their bodies motionless except for the slow rise and fall of breath. From this distance, the strange marks on their hides seemed to shift, as though they were not burned or cut but moving under the skin. A sound drew him to the porch, a steady ticking, too slow for a clock, too sharp for a dripping tap. It came from the barn. Samuel stepped out, the boards of the porch groaning under his weight, and the moment his boots hit the dirt, the smell returned. Metallic, sweet, and wrong. It grew thicker with every step, until he could taste it on the back of his tongue. The barn door was open wider than yesterday. A path of flattened grass led to it, darker than the ground around it, the blades slick and bent in the same direction. He paused at the threshold, the ticking louder now, joined by a faint scraping from somewhere above. He thought of the loft, of the rope swaying in the half-light. The smell was almost unbearable inside, like raw meat left to ripen in the sun, undercut by a sickly floral note that made his stomach lurch. He stepped inside, boots sinking slightly into the dirt floor. The air was damp, heavy enough to cling to his clothes. Dust floated in narrow beams from the cracks in the walls, swirling in patterns that seemed too precise to be random. The ticking came from deeper within, somewhere beyond the stalls. Something shifted in the shadows, a slow, deliberate movement. Samuel froze. A cow stood in the far corner, its head low, its eyes dull and glassy. The marks on its side glistened faintly, as if wet, and he could see them pulsing, expanding and contracting with each shallow breath. As he watched, one of the spirals uncurled slightly, like a waking snake, and settled into a new position. A creak came from the loft above. He tilted his head back, squinting into the gloom. A shape leaned just out of view, long and narrow, unmoving, except for the slow sway that matched the rhythm of the ticking. It was too still to be a person, too tall to be anything else. The cow shuddered, releasing a low, guttural moan that rose in pitch until it became something like a human sigh. The sound crawled under Samuel's skin, settling in his bones. He stepped back toward the door, but the path outside seemed darker now, the mist thickening into a wall. The ticking stopped. The scraping began again, closer this time, descending from the loft. He could hear it dragging along the wall, slow and patient. And then, just before it reached the floor, something else joined in. A soft, wet sound, like a tongue moving across wood. Whatever was coming down wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to be. The moment the shape touched the barn floor, the air changed. It wasn't just colder. It felt thinner, as though every breath Samuel took was filtered through something that didn't want him breathing at all. He couldn't see it clearly. The mist from outside had begun to pour through the open door, curling into the barn and coiling around the thing like it was an old friend. The cow in the corner staggered, its legs trembling as though they no longer belonged to it. The marks along its side were glowing faintly now, their spirals tightening, twisting into new configurations. Samuel watched in horror as one of the loops cinched tight, leaving an indentation in the animal's flesh deep enough to bead with dark fluid. The cow made no move to resist. It simply stood there, eyes fixed on something over his shoulder. He turned, slow, every nerve screaming for him to run, and saw the loft ladder. It was slick, shining wet like it had been dipped in oil, and from the rungs hung shreds of hair, animal or human he couldn't tell. The thing that had descended was still obscured, but he could make out its length. Impossibly tall, with limbs that didn't match the human blueprint. It leaned against the ladder like a guest making itself comfortable, head tilted too far to one side. Then, in the silence, came a sound that hollowed him out from the inside. His name. Not shouted, not even spoken with urgency. Just a calm, low whisper, Samuel, that seemed to come from inside his own skull. The voice was wrong, not because it was loud, but because it was close, too close. He backed toward the door, but the mist outside had sealed itself into a wall. Shapes moved within it, large and slow, each dragging something along the ground that left faint grooves in the dirt. He turned back to the barn's interior, and the thing by the ladder had taken a step toward him. The floor between them was covered now in symbols, identical to the ones on the cattle, only these writhed like living things. They curled and uncurled, dragging themselves across the ground as though rearranging into a sentence. A wet, deliberate dragging began again, and Samuel realized with a cold, precise dread that it was not coming from the thing. It was coming from all around him, as if the barn itself were shifting to close him in. The cattle moved in unison, stepping forward to form a half-circle around the far wall. Each animal's head lowered, their breathing synchronized. From the corner, one of the older cows gave a sound that was almost a laugh, deep and hollow, before stretching its neck to reveal the mark on its throat. In the dim light, Samuel saw the shapes along its skin shift into something he could almost read, an invitation or a command. He wasn't sure which. The thing by the ladder moved again, faster this time, closing half the distance between them in a lurch that made no sound. It stood there, swaying slightly, its head almost brushing the barn's roof beam. Then, with an awful, deliberate slowness, it bent forward, its face still lost in shadow, and reached out one long, jointless arm. The door behind Samuel slammed shut, though he hadn't touched it. Whatever was in this place had decided there would be no leaving. The arm stretched toward him, impossibly long, the skin pale and almost translucent, showing veins that pulsed in slow, deliberate rhythm. Samuel stumbled backward, his boots scraping against the dirt floor, but there was nowhere left to retreat. The mist was inside now, rolling along the ground like a living tide, swallowing his ankles, climbing higher with each breath. The smell was overwhelming. Iron, rot, and something sweet enough to make his teeth ache. The cattle's eyes glowed faintly in the gloom, reflecting a light that didn't exist anywhere else in the barn. Each of their strange markings was alive, rippling and twisting, and Samuel realized they were all forming the same shape. Spirals that tightened until they became perfect circles, black as an open grave. The figure straightened, and as it did, the shadows seemed to peel away from its face. What he saw should have been human, but wasn't. Its skin was stretched too tight, its mouth too wide, and its eyes were nothing but black pits that seemed to drink in the dim light. When it smiled, the movement was soundless, but felt in Samuel's bones, as if the expression had bypassed his eyes and gone straight to the core of him. It stepped closer without moving its legs, gliding in that unnatural way that made the air fold in around it. Its hand hovered inches from Samuel's chest, the fingertips quivering slightly as though they could already feel the beat of his heart. In the same moment, the barn's floor began to shake, not violently, but with a deep, resonant pulse, like the land itself was breathing beneath him. From above, the rope in the loft dropped lower, swinging as if something heavy had just been removed from it. Samuel glanced up in time to see a dark, wet shape retreat into the shadows of the hay door. The thing in front of him took that moment to speak again, not in words this time, but in a low, humming sound that seemed to resonate inside his skull. His vision blurred, and in the fog of his mind, images flashed. Cattle lying in open fields, their hides covered in spirals. Trenches in the earth filled with water black as oil. And faces he almost recognized, staring up from beneath the soil. The humming stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than any sound could have been. Then, with one swift movement, the figure pressed its hand to his chest. It wasn't a shove. It was a pull. Samuel felt the air rush out of him, felt something deep inside tearing loose, as if invisible roots were being ripped from the soil. His knees buckled. The cattle let out a single unified exhale, the sound carrying a strange rhythm, almost like a chant. The spirals on their bodies flared with a light that was neither fire nor electricity, bathing the barn in an otherworldly glow. Samuel's vision narrowed to a tunnel, the figure's faceless darkness filling it entirely. Just before the blackness swallowed him whole, he realized with cold certainty that the marks were not just on the cattle anymore. Something was burning them into his own skin. The last thing he heard before the darkness claimed him was the slow, wet dragging, now impossibly close, as if it were moving across his own ribs from the inside. When Samuel's eyes opened, the barn was quiet again. Too quiet. The mist was gone, and the early light of morning slanted in through the gaps in the boards, painting thin gold lines across the floor. The cattle stood where they had been, silent, motionless, their eyes dull and empty as glass. He tried to move, but his body felt stiff, heavy, as if the air itself were pressing him down. His chest ached with each breath, and there was a lingering warmth beneath his shirt. When he finally managed to lift his hand to touch it, his fingers brushed over something raised and tender. Pulling his shirt open, he saw them. Spirals, burned into his flesh, perfect and black, still faintly pulsing as though they had a heartbeat of their own. The memory of what had happened was fractured, slipping away like water through cupped hands. He remembered the voice, the pull, the way the marks had seemed to write themselves on the cattle. And now, they were on him. A soft sound drew his gaze toward the far corner of the barn. The rope in the loft swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Something small and dark fell from it, hitting the dirt floor with a soft thud. It was a button, pearl, with a hairline crack, just like the one he'd seen near the cedar tree days earlier. The cattle shifted then, all at once, turning their heads toward him. Their movements were slow, synchronized, as if they were following a single thought. The spirals on their bodies began to shift again, twisting and curling into new shapes. Samuel couldn't read them, but deep down, he felt their meaning, and it wasn't a warning. It was a summons. From outside, the sound of dragging returned, faint at first, then growing louder. Whatever had marked the cattle, whatever had marked him, hadn't left. It was still here, circling the barn, patient as before. Samuel backed toward the door, but the light coming in had already begun to dim, as if the morning had decided it didn't belong here. The air thickened with that sweet, metallic scent, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to hum. He stepped outside into the yard. The trench along the fence was deeper now, the piles of earth more deliberate, each one crowned with something pale and rounded. As he drew closer, he realized they were bones. Not animal bones. Human. The dragging stopped. From the barn doorway behind him came a soft, wet sound, the careful, methodical licking he'd heard before. He turned, but the darkness within was absolute, swallowing even the sunlight at the threshold. Then the voice came again, calm and close. "It's time." Samuel didn't run. Not because he didn't want to, but because his legs no longer belonged to him. Somewhere deep in the pasture, the cattle began to move, their spirals glowing faintly in the shadowed dawn. They weren't coming toward the barn. They were forming a path leading into the farthest field, into the place where the mist waited. And without a word, Samuel followed. The barn door yawned behind him, the rope in the loft swaying one last time as if waving him off. The farm was quiet again, but in that quiet, the ground whispered, and the marks beneath his skin answered.